everybody. We're so happy to see you here at 8 a.m. on a Friday morning. That's dedication. You must really want to learn about scoping reviews. I'm Mary Haas. Nice to meet you all from the University of Michigan. And I'm very honored to be giving this talk with my colleague, Dr. Gottlieb. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So we have no conflicts of interest, but we do want to thank Elizabeth Schoenfield because we adapted much of this content from a previous SAEM presentation. So we have 3 key learning objectives for you today. At the end of this talk, we want you to be able to do 3 things. One is that we want you to be able to explain the appropriateness of applications of scoping review methodology. 2 is that we want you to describe the 6 steps of a scoping review. And 3 is that we want you to be able to discuss the pearls and pitfalls of scoping reviews. And if you look at this QR code, there is actually a whole Google Drive of articles that may help you in your future endeavors. So when we talk about knowledge, what are we really talking about? I think we all know that there are literally thousands of new research publications coming out every day. And it's impossible to keep up with all of that. So we really need good evidence synthesis methodologies for us to be able to aggregate and accumulate data and be able to make sense of it. And scoping review is one form of evidence synthesis that can help in that process. We really like this definition by Kulkuhan et al. From a 2014 article. They define a scoping review as a form of knowledge synthesis that addresses an exploratory research question aimed at mapping key concepts, types of evidence, and gaps in research related to a defined area or field by systematically searching, selecting, and synthesizing existing knowledge. And Arksey and O'Malley, who are the experts in scoping review methodology, described 4 aims that a scoping review can be utilized for. 1 is to examine the extent, the range, and the nature of research activity in a given topic area. 2 is to determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review. Sometimes a scoping review can be the first step that then inspires the following systematic review. 3 is to summarize and disseminate research findings. And 4 is to identify research gaps in the existing literature, again, to hopefully spur future work. There's several different types of reviews that can be undertaken, and I put this slide up here to kind of show you some of the similarities and differences. Many of you have probably heard of and seen narrative reviews, which until recently was really the most common and influential method of examining recent or current literature. However, we've started to move away from that because it's the most subjective form of a review. There's not really a systematic standardized approach. And for that reason, it's the least transparent and the least replicable. Systematic and scoping reviews, on the other hand, both share that they utilize a standardized systematic approach, and that's what makes them a lot more replicable and robust in terms of methodology than a narrative review. A systematic review, however, is really intended to answer a specific question about a treatment or practice, whereas a scoping review is intended to identify and map available evidence in a given field. So they really have different goals. Systematic reviews tend to have the highest likelihood of being reproducible in terms of results, and they typically require rigorous interpretation through statistical methods like a meta-analysis. Scoping reviews are uniquely iterative, meaning the protocol and the approach can be adjusted as the search evolves, and they can identify follow-up areas for systematic reviews, as we mentioned. A key outcome of a scoping review that's different from a systematic review is it tends to generate a chart or a map that includes all of the articles searched, and that really helps you lay things out, again, to help identify gaps and themes. Narrowing it down, just looking at systematic and scoping reviews, both of them utilize a protocol, and that's where the systematic piece comes in. The search strategy and the protocol is developed in advance of actually conducting the search and typically registered for a systematic review. It can be registered for a scoping review as well, but as I mentioned before, the scoping review protocol can be iterative. Even though it's developed in advance of the search, it can be adjusted as you see what comes up in the search. The questions are also structured differently. So for a systematic review, the research question tends to follow the PICOS format for population, intervention, comparison, outcome, and study design. Versus for a scoping review, the question tends to be a bit more broad and follow the PCC format, so population, concept, and context. Two examples to kind of hammer this point home. For systematic review, one example is effect of medical scribes on throughput, revenue, and patient and provider satisfaction, a systematic review and meta-analysis. You can see that's very narrowly defined. There's an intervention, which is medical scribes. There are defined outcomes, which is throughput, revenue, and patient provider satisfaction. Versus an example scoping review, you can just see as more broad, race, racism, and anti-racism in emergency medicine. Whereas critical appraisal is mandatory in systematic reviews where you actually do an assessment of the bias of the studies that you're including. That's an optional portion of a scoping review. So a key question many of you are probably asking yourselves as you think about your own research questions at the moment is, should you go with a scoping review? Is that the right type of methodology? Well, if you're doing a search and you're seeing that the designs of the studies that you may want to include related to your research question are very heterogeneous, or that the field is emerging, complex, or large, or if your goals are to characterize, organize, and map rather than answer a specific question about an intervention, a scoping review is probably a good methodology for you. And I'll hand it over to Mike.
So that was a really great kind of primer on when you decide whether scoping review works and just kind of understanding the general architecture. Now I'll get a bit more granular and talk through how to do this. This is, it's a 20-minute didactic. We can't cover everything that goes in there. What this is meant to be is a primer, a starting resource to make sure everyone's level set, that everyone's aware of the key elements, whether you're a reviewer or the writer of a scoping review. But then it combines along with actually looking through the literature, looking at prior scoping reviews, talking to mentors. So when you're doing this, this should help to prime everyone so they're familiar with how to do this. But I do highly encourage, if you're going to pursue a scoping review, to then go back, look at some of the review articles we published on this and as of others, and so you can look through and see kind of what are these key elements. Let me make sure I map it against my paper so I'm doing it as rigorously, because we want you to be successful. We want you to be published when you put these papers out there. We want you to get the most robust evidence you can. So scoping reviews generally follow 6 steps. This is a fairly similarity across the different types of guidelines. Number 1, you identify a research question, you identify the relevant studies, you select the studies, you chart the data, you collate, summarize, put it into some form of thematic analysis, and then there's consultation with stakeholders. The 6th one was originally considered optional but has largely become the expectation. And so we break these things down. We say, number 1, identifying the research question. This one's really important because if you don't have the right research question, you're going to spend a lot of time on either a question that doesn't match the type of review or a question that may not be answerable. And so I'm looking at a research question. I say, number 1, you ran through your normal finer criteria. It could be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, relevant. Is something someone cares about as a topic. And then you want to say, is there enough literature to actually do a scoping review? So you're going to want to do a prelim search. And this step often gets missed. People jump into it, get really excited. We're like, why would I do a prelim search? I'm going to do a search later. This is inefficient. But in reality, if you don't do your prelim search and actually scope out and just get a sense of how broad the literature is, what's been done already, you're going to spend a lot of time chasing a rabbit hole and then have to go back to the drawing board later after you've expended much more effort. So engage a medical librarian. They're always, always helpful for trying to make sure you get the right searches of this. And just get a sense, if there's 3 articles, that may not be enough to really to map the literature. And you're going to have a scoping review that says there's actually not much literature out there, which is fine, but that's not very impactful, very meaningful. Maybe you need to expand your search. Maybe your search was focused on physicians and now we're going to include all healthcare staff. Similarly, maybe your search is too broad and it turns out you have 1,000 articles that could all meet in the scoping review. Well, you could do that, but it's going to take you about 5 years of your life to do so. And is that worth it? Do you have the money, the time, the effort, is that going to be enjoyable for you to go through 1,000 articles to try to develop a theme? Probably not. And so that initial pre-search to determine what's your actual question will help to ensure that what you're actually scoping out, the search you finally do is much more effective and more efficient for your time, even though it is an upfront effort. All right, so how do you identify your relevant studies? Number 1, engage a medical librarian. I have a couple medical librarians I work with at Rush. They are phenomenal. The number of times that they have helped me to either cut down the number of articles so I save my time or expand it to identify articles I would have missed is worth its weight in gold. And all it costs is time and an authorship role. It's free. It's amazing. They're at your institution. If they're not at your institution, they're in nearby institutions and they love to work with us on it. They're great collaborators. So engage them, help make sure that they can help make your search more robust and spend the time with them to learn how to do this. Next thing on there is, you want to use broad search, multiple different databases. You're going to pilot test your search. So if you did your initial pilot, you found 5 studies you knew were relevant. When you do your full search, If you go back and only 4 of those show up, figure out why that 5th article didn't show up. Ensure that your search actually captures the data you want. Think about your databases. In general, there's certain databases we all use. PubMed tends to be a common one. Scopus is a common one. But if you were, for example, looking in nursing and allied health, you might look at CINAHL. If you were looking for studies published in Latin America, there's LILACs. You want to, if you're looking at education research, it's ERIC and PsycInfo. You want to know the databases. And again, that goes back to talk to your medical librarian, understand which databases will find the studies you want because they're not all university listed. And then use software. When you start pulling the articles, I like I like Covidence, which is actually pronounced Covidence. And so Covidence is a really good source for like sorting and pulling articles through there. There's other ones that exist like Rayan and other ones. Excel I've used, it's really painful, so I wouldn't advise it. Covidence has a free trial, so if that's what you're going with, it's free the first round. Select your study. So study selection is a team process. It's always at least 2 people. The reason you have 2 people is that you're going through a lot of articles. There's a good chance that when you're tired, you're going to misclick, or maybe you have an intellectual bias and we don't think about an article. We say, I don't think that one meets it. But when you have 2 people, you double the chances that you're not going to miss an article or accidentally exclude it. It also allows you to make sure you're on the same page and you're vetting this because, as you know, Dr. Haas was saying, it's a iterative process. As you go through this, you're going to want to refine some of these questions, and having 2 people is much more likely to actually refine your search, ideally quicker when you have to go back and make any refinements. You'll make sure you have clear criteria, and you're going to adjust those over time. And then finally, just make sure you're documenting, tracking what you're doing. So if 2 people go through it, at the end, you want to try the best of your ability. Say like, okay, this is the, 2 people went through, we resolved all by consensus, or we pulled in a 3rd person to resolve discrepancies, and then we excluded, 1,852 articles, and now we have this many at this stage. You want to create kind of like a flow chart, just like you would with systematic review. You want to be able to show your work. You want people to see how you got there, why you excluded, particularly at the PDF stage. As far as charting the data, you're going to have a data extraction form. Another area that people don't think about is like pilot your form first. If you create a form and you haven't actually piloted on at least 1 or 2 articles, there's a good chance you're going to have to change it later. And it's much harder when you have to go back and fix data than if you just went through and piloted your data extraction from the beginning. So I pilot it out, I train our people. If it's going to be more than 5 or 10 articles in your review, you're going to want to do checks along the way. At a minimum, the beginning, middle, and end, you're checking in to say, hey, as I'm extracting this data, what things need to be changed? Where are the areas of confusion? Because if you wait until the end, you're going to spend substantially more time going back on articles you don't remember than when it's still fresh in your mind. So you're actually going to do these mid-checks, which is, again, different than how we use systematic reviews. It's a different style that we have to get used to, but it allows you to be more efficient and allows you to actually iterate much better. And then as far as when you're building a sheet, the other thing is a little bit different as opposed to discrete outcomes. You're going to have some theme elements. So like, for example, when we did a scoping review on education value units, we broke them down by like different types of units. So like academic, research, clinical, citizenship, kind of had them down like these elements, and we built in the categories throughout that, which is a little bit different than, again, relatively discrete elements that you see with systematic reviews. You're going to do kind of 2 forms of analysis with this. One is going to be quantitative, the normal things you're used to seeing, again, in systematic reviews, where it's like there was 52 articles, 32 of them were in the United States, half of them were UME, half of them were GME, but you're also going to want to have a theme, and this is where it gets a little more qualitative in nature. It's pulling from the qualitative approach of saying, let's identify the common themes across the different articles. So again, going back to EV used as an example, we went through and we started to map these out. And some articles just said, here are the 10 things we use. They didn't map it. They didn't say it was academic or clinical or research. They said, well, we reward people for publications. We reward people for submitting grants. We reward people for giving a presentation. And then we have to decide that. And that's not always clean and discrete. We reward people for mentoring a resident research project. It could be research or education. That's where that discussion comes in. That's where coming together and saying, all right, we're going to follow this common theme. And then you can map it out because everyone else reading through the literature is going to have to go repeat all the articles, read through, as we just gave a talk on EVUs yesterday, having gone through it like 40 plus articles and try to develop these themes. Our job is to then synthesize this so people can understand this and situate this and understand where the literature is. But it does require some of that nuance of starting to piece together and developing your themes together, because they're not always discrete. Like when someone comes in, and they're seeing with randomized controlled trial of scribe versus no scribe, does it affect throughput? That's very discrete, very clean, very easy. The scoping is where you have to be comfortable having those discussions, developing those themes. And the last one, so in the original work by Arksy O'Malley, when they did this, they talked about a 6th step called consulting with stakeholders. That had evolved over time with LEVAC, where this became kind of a more standardized step, and it's been highly recommended and more commonly seen. This is an area that I think has 2 values. One is when you have kind of your, they call it stakeholders or your relevant parties that are involved in this. One thing is that they're going to give you, meaningful feedback on maybe articles you missed, maybe themes you missed, maybe contextualizing this. We did a scoping review looking at holistic review. And so with the holistic review, we looked at everything from, our relevant parties in this one, include everything from institutional, diversity officers through residents and prospective students. Because all along the spectrum, everyone has a different lens, a different viewpoint, and we want to make sure that we were being representative and thoughtful in how we put this article together. And so kind of looking at the different relevant aspects and be able to document what you did. These are the number of people I asked. This is the range of people we asked. If they're amenable, I add them as acknowledgements every time. And this is what we changed. So people can see this is what meaningfully changed based on these consultation with your relevant parties. A couple limitations to be aware of scoping reviews. So again, it has to be the right question. If you don't ask the right question, you're going to find you spend a lot of time spinning your wheels. You're going to consistently keep changing your question and iterating. If you don't spend that initial time to really say, is my question right? And let me pilot search and make sure the data can now support the question I asked. Scoping reviews are time consuming. They don't seem like they're going to be time consuming, but when you're in it, because you have to iterate, because you have to have those discussions, because it has more back and forth, it takes more time, but it is really fun. Like, it is really fun when you go through and you can start to kind of piece together this messiness of the world of research that exists out there and put together a theme and information and identify both this is what we know and here are the gaps, and you create the calls to action that you always wanted to say, this is what the data shows we haven't done, now here's what we need to do. And then again, keep in mind it's a lot of data. You have to parse it out. And if you don't spend enough time in that data extraction form, thinking through the elements you really want, and then going back to it after you've gone through a couple and iterating it, you're going to find at the end you're going to have a ton of data and not know what to do with it. So spend the time. It's a lot more conversant. It's a lot more collaborative. It's a good one to do with friends. All right. So summary, we talked about systematic versus scoping reviews. We talked about how they differ, different nuances of them. In here you have a QR code, some amazing resources that we want you to have. Because again, as I said, this is a primer. In 20 minutes, it only serves a primer to give you kind of a base foundation to then go back and dive into these a little bit further. Everything here is much more in depth to allow you to really kind of push yourselves to apply this in here. Tap mentors. And with that, I wanted to open up and see if you have any questions.
You mentioned some databases specifically for medical education. Well, what were those databases that you mentioned that you, I guess, go to frequently for when you do scoping reviews and that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we speak to databases, the core ones are almost always going to have PubMed in there. Yeah. And often it will entail some version of either Scopus or Web of Science. Those are kind of based across everything. It's exceedingly rare not to see at least PubMed plus or minus one of those. When you look, then you start to do nuance. So to your point, in the education realm, yeah. ERIC, E-R-I-C, and PsycInfo, which is P-S-Y-C-H-I-N-F-O, are probably the 2 biggest ones. The other one I would recommend, and I put this universally in all of my systematic reviews and scoping reviews for probably the past 5 years, is Google Scholar, with the caveat that when you Google, how many answers do you get back? Like a million, right? It's massive. Google Scholar is not quite as massive, but it's still big. You're going to get like 1 million answers, and you're not going to go through 1 million. So what Bramer, so Wilhelm Bramer is relatively very well known as a medical librarian, expert in this topic, has published on in 2005, is that you only need the first 200 and you capture the majority of what you want. So I use Google Scholar to the first 200, and it's a much, much more effective model because you capture the articles you might otherwise miss, some of the gray literature, but at the same time, you're not going through 1 million, you're just doing 200, which is a drop in the bucket of often what's closer to 2,000 to 4,000 articles.
Can you give a few more practical tips on how you engage stakeholders? Like, for example, when you talk to the authors of the articles that are in your review, like, how do you decide who your stakeholders are and what questions you ask them?
Oh, sure. I think engaging the people of the population you're studying can be valuable. So if you're doing a medical education interview or medical education focused topic about medical students, having a medical student review the findings and provide input. I also agree with engaging experts in the field. So just think about like who is most impacted by, who is the population you're studying and who is most impacted and cares most about the content that you're reviewing. And then probably the questions you would ask would be specific to what you're actually looking at, but does this make sense? Are we missing things? How do you react to the findings that we've discovered would be some examples of what you could ask.
And do you report that out, like in your review, we engaged X stakeholders who gave the following feedback?
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's reporting everything you did, so it's usually about a paragraph. It's not a very lengthy reporting, but I would say, for example, we engaged 12 stakeholders who ranged from, medical, or who included medical students, residents, program faculty, and institutional DIOs. Amongst this, we shared the resources and solicited feedback. An example, because you're not going to list 7 things. An example of a change that occurred as a result of this was the inclusion of professional identity formation as a founding principle for our discussion section. That would be that would be all you'd say. Just kind of giving them, because you have to list everything, but you're giving them a sense of like, no, I really did engage them and actually change things now, because they want to see that you meaningfully engage them.
And I think this is where finding examples, like actually looking at other scoping reviews is helpful, because you can see, the variety of ways that people have approached it, but I think what you said makes sense.
No, and I found 2 ways work for this, by the way, for scope. Well, 3 ways I've seen this work for engaging stakeholders to operationalize this. Number 1, you can do like a kind of a virtual pitch, and you can just like get on Zoom and like talk them through it. Because some people are like, I'm not going to look at your manuscript. I just want to hear about it. You'll pitch to them. The other one I most commonly use is I save a copy of my manuscript that is now in a separate Google Doc, and I just give them access, and I tell them like, go fully redline, get anything on there, but don't waste time on grammar. I want to know thoughts, content, references, but I will check grammar, don't even think about that. I'll hold your brain, give me your lens. And I generally pick people that are going to be like very responsive and very critical. So this is the time you really want every reviewer to across the spectrum of it. The resident who's like, I don't like your plan, to the the person you're like, they're going to critique this. That's who you want. You want it at this stage. Because it's not just about making sure it's a really good product out there, it's that your goal of this is reaching out to stakeholder, or reaching out to the public policy. Like, scoping reviews are meant to be shared broadly, and so you want to make sure that you're reflecting those lenses before you put it out there.
Would you say is the sort of industry standard to have that medical librarian be a co-author after that initial help you get?
It's a lot of work for the medical librarians, and yes, I think absolutely to get them on board and to like acknowledge their contributions, authorship is typically, and they will often help write the methodology section as well.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is you want to make sure you have the conversation about the expectations early, and also then if you're going to do that, ensure they can meet the ICMG criteria, the International Committee on Medical Journalism Ethics, and basically. The challenge there sometimes is if you say to a medical librarian, like, hey, we run the search, and then you don't do anything after that, then ethically it's a little vague because they haven't really met the criteria, but they've done work. So I will usually try to make sure that they're helping write the methods, and they've set that standard expectation at the beginning, and that's often how I'll work with my medical librarians. I work with the same. All right, so I'd love you to be an author on this. Here's the expectations of authorship in this. I would expect that you help me run the search, and we'll do it collaboratively. That you help pull the PDFs for me, which is worth its weight in gold, and you'll help me write part of the methods section. And then everyone's exactly on the same page. Everyone's ethically met the criteria, but also that you're like recognizing the substantial amount of effort that's involved in it.
So they'll pull the PDFs and create like a file that you and the other co-authors can like go to.
They can. Again, I use Providence, and so Providence is a kind of an online portal that lets you just drop things in there and select it. It is much more effective. So yes, they could do that, and it's probably a little easier for them, but in terms of actually doing it for yourself on the back end of working together, it's so much easier to use software. Rand's another one, it's also free, but I would say that use a software, it's going to be much, much easier on you and your reviewer than if you're trying to do it by hand off the PDFs.
And oftentimes an institution will have a license for a software, so you don't necessarily have to pay for it yourself.
Does Providence have an option for data extraction, or is that done directly?
Yeah, It does, the problem is it's not well set for scoping. For systematic reviews, yes, it's actually gotten very nice, I've started using it now. But for scoping reviews, because it's iterative, it's not well set up to go back and change things very easily. So you can do it, but it tends to be more work than just having an Excel sheet. So I tend to use a Google Sheet, and we both share access and we just kind of work through it together.
And I will say too, this is out of the scope of this talk, but I do think AI will probably evolve the way that we do a lot of the systematic and scoping reviews. I know there's increasing technology about extracting from the literature and extracting data that this will likely be a different presentation in a few years.
Maybe we'll next talks.
Yeah.
When you mention like the data extraction form or like the Google Sheet, do you have like a standard one that you kind of have like sections that I always kind of use and then I just plug and play with whatever question that I have? And they're like kind of set standard ones that people have like as best practice of how they set up their data extraction?
I mean, typically you're always going to have study title, year, population studied. Those I feel like are pretty standard. And then I would say the rest of them are very tailored to the study, you know, because they're going to mimic your research question. So if you're studying the population of undergraduate medical education, you know, you're going to have that column in your Excel sheet kind of mapping to like the study population, and that's going to vary depending on what population you're studying. So there's some core ones, just nuts and bolts, but a lot of it I think really does vary by what you're studying.
Yeah, I would say that systematic reviews, 70% overlap probably between them, but
Yeah.
for scoping it's like 20-30%.
Okay.
That's a steal like an artist, and so what I recommend is if you look up the one, and I just used an example of the either my ED or my holistic one review, scoping reviews, they're in academic medicine. In the appendix, there is my data extraction sheet. So you can just take it and modify as you see fit as a starting point. That helps to like shorten the alphabet on that.
Awesome.
All right, thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everybody.